Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Dram Show with me, Chris Goodrum. Okay, as per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, commented, all that kind of stuff. I will catch up with all the comments and reply to them hopefully over the weekend. So, you know, just bear with me if I haven't replied as yet. This week I fancied doing something a little bit different, and I fancied doing something American. I haven't done an American episode of the show for a long time, so before we kind of get into the nitty gritty of it, I suppose, the disclaimer for today is that all of these samples do come from 2014 and 2015 when I was doing the new releases tastings for the Whisky magazine. So they may not be indicative of the current releases from these particular distilleries, and because I've got 6 of them, I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail about the individual distilleries themselves, and because you've got their websites, and you can check out their information. And as a lot of you guys are actually from the States that watch the show, you probably know of these distilleries anyway. But I guess that there's 2 reasons for doing this particular episode of the show. Firstly, is that there's still, I think, there's still a kind of belief, I guess, wrongly I would say, that American whiskey begins and ends in Kentucky. You know, that's all there is to American whiskey. It's all Bourbon, you know. When, you know, and I think sort of a lot of the, you know, consumers that aren't particularly knowledgeable about the industry believe that, and of course we know that's completely different. Across the whole of America there are, you know, a number of smaller craft distilleries, I guess, and I mean, you know, you could argue that sort of, you know, 20 odd years ago the sort of that was kind of true, I suppose, you know, that American whiskey was all about Bourbon, but and it was only then that sort of, you know, about 20 years ago, the first of the sort of like what they called, you know, the craft distilleries, craft breweries started cropping up, and nowadays they're everywhere. I mean, you know, here in the UK, you know, there are an inordinate number of you know, small breweries, microbreweries, that kind of thing, and the market is really vibrant. It's a great scene, and you know, you can say the same for sort of like, you know, micro and sort of craft. I mean, I hate all these names, but, you know, small distilleries that have sort of set up in the USA and are at the sort of like the forefront of you know, trying out different things. So yeah, it's kind of like, you know, trying to sort of introduce a few of these distilleries while I still have the samples. And the second reason for doing this week's episode, so it kind of comes back to the whole transparency concept. You're probably wondering what the hell I'm talking about. Well, one of the whiskies we're looking at today is from Strahamans in Colorado, and back in, I think it was like 2014, 2015, which is when this sample comes from. I'm not talking about this particular sample. The chap behind the distillery, Jess Glacier, I believe his name is, launched a product called Tin Cup, and it was it's called an American whiskey, but it also prominently features the name Colorado on the label, and so you think, well, okay, this guy owns Strahamans in Colorado, must be from Colorado, must be a Colorado whiskey. But in actual fact it's not. It's an American whiskey, and only a proportion of the spirit came from Strahamans, the rest coming from MGP. Now, in itself, it's not an issue. You know, there are a number of brands that are made by MGP or feature spirit distilled by MGP. You know, sort of Dickel being a classic example, and Bullet Rye, for example, is another one. So that wasn't the whole issue. The whole issue was the opacity, the fact that it appeared to claim to be a Colorado whiskey when in actual fact probably the bulk of the spirit was distilled, you know, nowhere near Colorado. And I suppose if the whiskey had been really, really good, you know, nobody would have really cared. But in actual fact, it wasn't really that good at all. Certainly not the sample that I tasted anyway. And it kind of leads on, like I said, to the whole opacity thing. I mean, for example, you have Whistlepig. Now, Whistlepig buys spirit from Canada, or did, ages it for 3 years in America, and, well, bingo, suddenly it's an American spirit. Well, how does that work? It wasn't produced in America, it's just spent some time there, you know. And then you have Japan. I mean, Japan is even worse. I mean, I don't even think that you have to actually age your spirit in Japan. You know, as long as it's bottled in Japan, it's Japanese whiskey. And you sort of like think, well, hang on, something's not right here, you know. And they're not doing anything illegal. So that the problem lies within the legislation, the framework. And if it was me, I would have divided it into two. So I would have had, for example, Japanese distilled whiskey was a category, and Japanese bottled whiskey, a completely separate category. And I'm surprised that the Japanese distillers don't do that. I would have done the same in America. I'd have probably gone even further and had, you know, the designation of Colorado distilled whiskey, for argument's sake, and Colorado bottled whiskey, Kentucky distilled whiskey, etc., etc. You see what I'm getting at? And I think nowadays, with a lot more, you know, producers, distillers, you know, started by people like, you know, Bruichladdich and Compass Box, and carried on, you know, by a number of the newer distilleries. That, you know, they want to say to the customers, look, you know, this is where everything comes from. This is where our grain comes from. This is where our casks come from. You know, even down to sort of like, you know, what colour underwear the distiller was wearing the day that it was distilled. You know, and I mean, a lot of this information is kind of like, you know, really for geeks only. But the point being is that it seems to me that these distilleries are proud of what they're doing and want to tell everybody about, you know, everything about it, you know, what the makeup is, cask wise, all that kind of stuff. And, you know, the more information, the better. You know, there's no need for opacity. And I think the reason why you have this opacity is the big boys are basically afraid of giving away trade secrets. Who cares if we know what Johnny Walker is made from? We can figure it out, you know. We don't know the exact sort of blend of say, Johnny Walker Black Label. You can hazard a guess. And even if you did recreate it, you can't call it Johnny Walker Black Label. You have to call it something else, you know. And it's... So why the necessity to be opaque? You know, it drives me nuts, it has to be said. But anyway, so enough of that. I'm going to sort of clamber off my soapbox now, and let's just take a look at today's lineup, shall we? Right, okay, so I've had these samples sat around for, well, obviously 5-6 years, you know, and I've been, yeah, as I keep saying, you know, it's all about trying to sort of shoehorn an episode of the show in, and I just felt like doing it, you know, so, you know, you'll kind of have to live with me. Right, so the first bottling we'll be looking at is a bottling called Wheatfish American Wheat Whiskey, distilled by Glacier Distilling Company, who are based in a place called Goodrum in Montana. I believe was founded in around about 2009-2010. It's bottled at 45%, and it is based on the recipe for Great Northern Brewing Company's Wheatfish Lager. So I don't know whether they I don't know whether it's probably not the actual lager, because I mean certainly a lot of the other spirits that I've tasted that have been based on beer do tend to sort of omit certain things like the hops and what have you. So I'm guessing it's obviously the mash is based on their sort of blend of grains, I imagine. So that should be really interesting. Second bottle we'll be looking at is from Portland in Oregon. This is Westwood Straight Malt Whiskey. Now, this is a single barrel bottling. I don't think they actually do this bottling anymore. It's bottled at 45%. And like I said, I first tasted this in 2015. So certainly looking at their website, they don't seem to imply that they do a single barrel bottling anymore. Whether they're now doing it as a limited edition, I honestly couldn't tell you, but that's what I've got here in front of me. Third bottling we'll be looking at is from Brooklyn in New York. This is called the Van Brunt Stillhouse single malt whiskey, and this is small batch lot number 7, bottled at 42%. Like I said, coming from 2015. Don't know what lot they're on at the moment, but they seem to have certainly expanded their range since that time. So like I said, you know, I think really this tasting is for sort of entertainment purposes only, should we say. The next bottling we'll move on to is another New York distillery. I may well pronounce this incorrectly, so please cut me some slack. Adirondack Distillery Company. This is their 601 small batch bourbon. They're based in Utica in New York. It's bottled at 43.2%, and I believe the spirit is aged up to about 4 years of age and is 100% corn. So could have called it a corn whiskey, but they chose to call it a bourbon. And again, this is it, you know, another misconception is that bourbons can only be made in Kentucky. Well, of course they can't. I mean, as long as you adhere to the sort of like the regulations, you know, 51% corn, brand new American oak, it's a bourbon. So anyway, moving swiftly on, this is, yeah, that is indeed this. This is from a company called Dry Fly Fishing Distilling Company, I believe is their full title. And this is the Tritical Whiskey, which is a rye wheat hybrid grain that I believe was actually created in Scotland. The distillery itself is found in Spokane in Washington, and it's bottled at 44%. And I think of all of these spirits, I think this is the only one you could and possibly still can get here in the UK. I don't think any of the others actually have made it over the pond, as they say. And the last bottling is indeed the Strahamans. This is the Snowflake, bottled at 47%. Now this is quite an interesting whiskey. It is a minimum, I believe, of 2 years old, aged in. I did have a note of. Oh yeah, two years in. So I think it's number 3 charred American white oak, and then finished in another cask. Now, like I said, this sample comes from 2014, and I think the finishing cask was ex-Merlot. And the other interesting thing about this is that it's only available from the distillery and only available for 1 day in December. I mean, okay, interesting. I mean, yeah, I don't know quite how I feel about that. It's sort of, is it a gimmick? Is it really interesting? I mean, yes, it's going to get you sort of like your fans to the distillery for that particular day. Probably didn't happen this year or last December, I imagine. But interesting concept, I guess. And certainly when I'm not going to say any more, to be honest with you. It's an interesting idea. So anyway, that's today's lineup. I think this is going to be really, really intriguing. So let's kick off with a bit of Wheatfish then. Right, okay, so let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? That's a lovely nose. It's very estery. I'm getting lots of pear, pineapple, apricot, melon. Again, it's got that sort of like, you know, sweeter wheaty edge to it rather than a sort of a darker wheatiness. There's a little bit of, it darkens a little bit, I suppose. It gets a little branny. There's a touch of American oak, a little bit of earth. I mean, it's not particularly old. I would guess, again, you know, this is probably around about 3 years, maybe 4. But it's wonderfully estery. It's wonderfully fruity. It's really nice. I mean, there's no faintiness, no off notes, and it has that sort of, you know, a youthful intensity, should we say. Anyway, let's see what that's like. It's a little astringent on the finish, a little dry, a little short. not quite as fruity on the palate, a little more oiliness, a little bit more American. Certainly the oak kind of digs in and bitters a little bit at the finish. I mean, it has an underpinning of that sort of estery, pineapple, pear, peach character that I discovered on the nose, but it was a little bit more hidden beneath the oiliness of the actual spirit. And I don't know, I liked it. I mean, I thought it was a really good spirit. And you know, sometimes you sort of like, you kind of like, I don't mind a bit of a disconnect, I suppose, between the nose, as long as I can still pick it up, or pick up the sort of like those kind of main elements. I mean, maybe I would have liked to have seen a little bit more fruit on the palate, a little bit more of that estery fruit, because that's what kind of ticks my box at the end of the day. And you know, it has a sort of Macmyra-y kind of character, and I suppose, I mean, I do tend to sort of mention that and quite often, but to me, Macmyra is just such a benchmark, and just such a benchmark kind of characteristic, that I do tend to sort of measure a number of other spirits kind of against that, rightly or wrongly, but that's what I do. But so yeah, I thought that this was pretty good stuff. Okay, so let's move on to the Westwood. So this is a single barrel, single malt whiskey. Let's see what the nose gives us. Right, yes, it's kind of quite young. It's a lot of oak up front. I'm getting a lot of kind of toffee, coffee, and again, it's got a more corny kind of character, not a sweet corn, but there is that sort of, what's the technical term, slight fluffiness, and it's got some nuttiness to it. There's pecan. I'm getting a little bit of praline, touch of honey. I mean, it's kind of developing. I mean, for a young spirit, it's got some character. It has to be said. Although I think a lot of it is kind of coming from the oak, but it's not overly oaked. It's not too intrusive. Let's see what the palate's like. Not quite sweet on the palate, on the nose. The alcohol is kind of kicking that sweetness a little bit. So it is a little intrusive. It's a little short again, and this is always the problem with young spirits. They just don't have the length. So you are getting a little bit of bitter oak at the finish. Again, I don't think that's an issue. I think it's got a lovely mouthfeel, a little less of the oak character on the palate. It's a little bit more supportive, so I am getting a little bit more spirit character, a little bit more maltiness, and a little bit more youthfulness, although I'm not getting sort of off the still notes, so it's certainly, you know, not unpleasant to drink. It's just a little bit on the short side, but again, that's all down to the age of the spirit. So, you know, I think that's pretty good. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Van Brunt Stillhouse bottling. Let's see what nose goes on this now. Now this is totally different to the Westwood. I mean, completely different. Real chalk and cheese. You would have thought this was a rye. It's really herbal. It's really intense. It's kind of edgy. It reminds me of the Corsair Rasputin, and that was, I think, distilled from a stout mash. And although it doesn't have a stouty character, it's that intense, oily, herbal, green tea, cardamom, almost hops, and so it really does feel like this has been distilled from a beer mash. It's a little bit of barley, a little bit of boiled sweets. It's young, it's raw, it's not unpleasant. Again, it's interesting. There's again a little bit of oak coming through. I'm getting a little nuttiness, touch of honey. It's interesting. Let's see what the past one. Ooh, that's a finish. Right, so it kind of kicks off with the oak. I'm getting sort of toffee and vanilla, and it's a little bit sort of reserved, and then the herbally kind of weirdness kind of kicks in on the mid palate. Camphor, bitter rye, cedar, toast, real oily, almost rye-like notes. Greenwood, you know, it's kind of, it's weird, basically. It's weird in a good way, but it's not the sort of thing I would want to drink all of the time. I could imagine sort of like, you know, having a bottle of this open, thinking, I'm in the mood for something a bit left field, you know, and going for that maybe at the end of an evening, you know, because you drink that sort of straight off, and well, you know, I wouldn't say your taste buds are knackered, but you know, it's got personality, and probably with hindsight, I probably should have put it at the end now. But anyway, as I was saying to you know, the customers that came to last week's this week's whiskey evening. In fact, you know, choosing the lineup or the order in which you taste whiskies in is just so difficult. It really is. It's hard as kind of matching food and wine, to be honest with you. You're kind of thinking, you know, how do I lead these along? And sometimes you get it wrong, and you put a whiskey in the wrong place, and it just doesn't seem to show well. But anyway, I'm kind of waffling on. So yes, interesting, fun, but I wouldn't want more than one. Oh God, I'm a poet. Matter anymore. Now you're way too far. Right, okay, so let's move swiftly on to the second of the distilleries that are based in New York. This is the Adirondack distillery, or distilling company. Actually, the first time I encountered this particular distillery, I think it was a vodka. I think that when I was judging World Vodka Awards. Anyway, I'll just digress. Anyway, kind of typical corn, very corny, oily, heavy, toasty oak, thick slabs of corn. Little young, little spirity. There's a slight herbalness to it, which kind of like, again, sort of like I think, And certainly when I tasted it blind, I thought, bit of rye there, Bourbon, but in actual fact there is no rye. So just goes to show, doesn't it, that sometimes these things can kind of throw you a bit of a curveball. A little bit of citrus, a little bit of orange, possibly. Yeah, I mean that's pretty well balanced. I think it's like I said, it's a little bit young, a little bit spirity at the edge, but you know it's and yeah, all right, it's very corny, but you know what? I suppose for if you're sort of putting it in kind of corn whiskey, if you were putting this in a corn whiskey tasting, it would probably blow most corn whiskies away. It has to be said, because there is a lot more going on than your average corn whiskey, which tends to be sort of relatively simple. And yeah, okay, let's see what the parts are. Young, relatively straightforward, corny, a little bit of oak, it kind of does what it says, I suppose, at the end of the day. You can't argue with that. I mean, it's got a reasonably good length. It's a bit simple. I don't know what it retails for in the States, but I wouldn't have thought this was particularly expensive, or at least I hope not. And so again, it's pleasant. You know, there's no fireworks. It's not got the weirdness of the previous bottling. It's just a sort of like a well put together, well crafted whiskey at the end of the day. And you know, like I said, if it's not too expensive, yeah, that's not too bad. Okay, so moving on to the Tritical, so Rye Wheat Hybrid. Let's see what those gives us. I'm not getting a great deal actually, it's a little bit reserved. Now I'm getting some buttery oak, chunky, grainy, spicy, little coffeed, interesting, slightly herbal. Does kind of remind me of rye. Don't get a sort of a particular wheatiness. I don't get the sweetness though of, say, corn, for argument's sake. It has an astringency, a dryness, a spiciness. So I mean, if I was tasting this blind, I would certainly say this was a rye whiskey. Although there is a slight softness to it. But then, you know, the thing is with rye is that you can have really intense, hard, peppery kind of rye, and you can have softer, kind of slightly more, you know, sexier rye, I suppose, for want of a better word. Oh, sorry, I'm being a bit sexist there. Oops. No, so kind of coming back to yeah, it's an interesting nose, and the fact that it's an interesting grain as well. You know, think, well, why not? You know, so that's right. That's got a nice aftertaste. It's actually got quite a good length for a young spirit. Nice kind of spiciness, intensity on the finish. Kind of opens up with a little bit more of the oak. I'm getting more of the toastiness, more of the vanillins, and there's a slight burntness there on the edge. It kind of, again, reminds me of some Bourbons, which tend to have that slightly burnt corn kind of note. Although there's no, as far as I'm aware, there's no corn in here. Again, another one of throwing you a curveball. And it has that lovely sort of rye-like sort of spice. Again, it's kind of soft. It's not as intense as, say, a sort of a high rye content rye. Yeah, I mean, I like it. It's fun. It's interesting, and again, it's a sort of like, you know, as long as it's not too expensive, I think this was certainly a lovely whiskey to go for. Again, you know, it's got a good length, probably slightly longer than some, but again, there's that bitterness, there's that youthfulness, and although, like I said, you know, in some cases, that sort of you love that kind of youthful intensity. You have to realise that, you know, with that intensity comes certain sort of limitations, I guess. And as long as you accept that fact, then great. And yeah, so really intriguing. Right, okay, and finally we're on to the Strahamans. So this is the Snowflake. And like I said, I think this particular bottling was finished in Merlot casks. Let's see what the nose goes. Well, that's a bit unusual. I get cider apple, cinnamon, berries, touch of herbs. There's a sort of little astringency there as well, a smokiness, a little bit of violet. There's an almost wheatiness as well. I mean, this is a really quite a complex spirit. Again, it's young, but it's It's pretty complex. I mean, yeah, you can smell that there is some sort of wine finish going on here, because it does have that slight sort of soft, winey, chocolatey, dark, black fruit, coffee. I mean, that's a lovely nose at the end of the day. Absolutely delightful, because, you know, it's not all about the wininess. There is some intensity from the spirit character, and I suppose, again, it's the youthfulness is kind of, in this instance, helping it, you know, because it has that intensity to it. See what that's on. Oh my god, that really grips on the finish. But dear god, that's mouth-watering as well. That's fruity. I mean, that is just that's a lovely balanced finish at the end of the day. It's got enough intensity of bitter, sort of chocolatey oak tannins, and juicy fruit. It's probably a little more heavier on the wine cask finish on the palate than it is on the nose. Again, it has a herbalness, so I'm certainly getting a kind of like a slight rye-like kind of note. So I would assume that the mash bill is probably, I don't know whether this is a malt, or if I would guess probably not 100% malted barley. I would guess there must be some rye in there somewhere. I could completely be wrong, because again, it could be throw me a complete curveball. It could be the Merlot cask that's giving me all that herbal, sort of slightly rye kind of notes. But either way, I mean, that's a lovely whiskey, and it shows that sort of, yet again, the distillery is producing some what appears to be producing some really interesting stuff. I mean, I've tasted their I can't remember which other bottling. I have tasted one other bottling. I think it's a kind of standard bottling on a couple of occasions. On one occasion I was really impressed, and the other occasion I wasn't. But you know, this is a thing nowadays. You know, as I'm not kind of, you know, doing the whiskey magazine thing anymore, I don't get the opportunity to try these whiskies anymore, unfortunately. But you know, I have these samples, and it's been fun looking back, shall we say. So anyway, so coming back to the Snowflake, certainly I think the term Snowflake is a derogatory term for certain individuals, I believe. It's certainly not a snowflake in that term. It's got lovely intensity. So yeah, that was really nice.
Because I'm afraid of the dark.
You know I love you, don't you?
Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Well, you know, I thought it was interesting. I had fun. Hopefully you guys had some fun as well. I mean, I know that that for a number of you that are watching the show, you probably won't have the opportunity to taste these spirits because they're not obviously available in, you know, your markets. And certainly, like I said, I think the only one that's available in the UK is the dry fly fishing. But you know, I think it just basically goes to show that American craft distillery is very vibrant. It's producing some really different things. It's not Bourbon all the time. It's not just Kentucky. It's not just the same old. And if you are looking for something a little bit off the beaten track, then you know, try an American whiskey. Try something slightly different. I mean, there are, I would imagine, in all the markets of the world, at least sort of some. So, you know, give them a try. But anyway, coming back to today's tasting, Glacier Distilling, I really liked that. I thought that was a lovely whiskey. You know, the whole sort of like wheated concept, liked it. Nice estery nose, maybe not quite so much on the palate, but you know, I thought, again, for a young whiskey, really intriguing. The Oregon, yeah, again, a very enjoyable whiskey. It was pretty young, but it had plenty of character as far as I could see. You could argue that the alcohol was a little intrusive, a little aggressive, but overall, you know, I wouldn't sort of like have an issue with that. The Van Brunt Stillhouse, weird. I won't sort of lie to you on that one, and like I said, it's not the sort of whiskey that I think that I would probably want too many glasses of an evening, but certainly I think if you were to sort of stick that into a tasting, it would certainly sort of raise a few eyebrows. I think it would be a bit of a kind of a love-hate kind of thing, but you know, you want whiskey with personality, and you can't argue that it doesn't have personality. The Adirondack, again, yeah, nice, pleasant whiskey. Easy going. Like I said, if I don't think it's too particularly expensive, I would quite, yeah, that would be a whiskey that I would quite happily drink on a daily basis. I think for sort of like I said, for 100% corn whiskey, I think it has, you know, a lot of complexity, probably more so than you would expect from a 100% corn whiskey. So yeah, good stuff. The Tritical, yeah, again, another really interesting whiskey. I like sort of different things. It's you know, it's an intriguing kind of grain. It certainly has you know, elements of rye and wheat. So it's kind of like almost a kind of a shortcut from, you know, if you, I don't want to bother sort of putting together a kind of a rye wheat kind of mash. Well, I'll just use Tritical instead. Job done. And yeah, interesting. And I suppose, and the same you could go for the Strahamans. Again, another really interesting whiskey. Certainly unusual. Certainly to me it was quite an unusual whiskey. And you know, it kind of worked quite nicely. Yeah, okay, you could argue that the wine character was a little on the heavy side. But again, it all comes down to sort of like the age of the spirit. It's not very old, 2-3 years, probably 3 years at the very most, I would guess. Pretty much like all of them, but they all of these whiskies kind of share a youthful intensity, and with that youth you have to sort of like accept there are some limitations at the end of the day. But yeah, good fun. Really enjoyed this week's episode of the show. Haven't got a clue what I'm going to be doing next week. I'll kind of probably figure that out on Thursday, I imagine. So it gets to that time of the week where I'm thinking, what the hell am I going to do at the weekend? But anyway, so I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode of the show. Please keep your comments coming, and all I have to say is good afternoon, and it is afternoon. Good dramming.